Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and it's my pleasure today to welcome a stellar panel on the issue of big tech, cybersecurity, and American national security. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground because we have such a learned and knowledgeable cast here today to discuss these issues. And I'm going to begin with Sarah Krebs of Cornell University, who is also the author of an excellent book on the United States' financing of its wars that I actually reviewed several years ago in the National Interest. So the first question that I'm going to pose to Sarah and our other panelists is, I got a nice email yesterday from Chaz Freeman, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia and also a China expert. And he sent me a speech that he recently delivered at the Metropolitan Club. And I wish I'd been there because when I was reading it, I found it extremely interesting. And one part in particular, he zeroed in on the US-China competition. And he pointed to the technological edge that he believes China is gaining over the United States. And in that, he said, for example, that China now has 9 times more 5G stations than the United States, and that its high savings rate allows it to draw on great amounts of capital to bolster its technological inroads abroad as well. So Sarah, I'd like you to tackle this first. Are Chaz's concerns warranted, or is the United States in fine shape with its dominance in big tech?
Well, thank you, Jacob, and thanks to the panelists for being part of this great conversation today. So on that opening question, it's a really good one, and it's one that I think how I've thought about this kind of US-China tech race has changed a little bit in the last few years. I think I shared the concern a couple of years ago when it looked like China was engaged in this sort of monumental ascent and managing to kind of do better on everything from kind of the internet to drones to all of these, social media than the US. And I think as I look at this now, sort of the time horizon has changed a little bit. And I personally am of the view that sort of US innovation and real kind of private industry is allowing the US over the longer term to show sort of the dominance of a strategy where there really is free enterprise. And I think we've seen this in a couple of ways. China's pretty fraught relationship with Tencent, some of their sort of so-called capitalist industries are very fraught because those companies are always having to toe a certain line. And I think that's limiting the degree to which they can really truly innovate. I also think what I've seen in the last couple of years, especially with COVID, is this real preoccupation on the part of the Chinese government with what is a very delicate domestic stability situation. They have 1.3 billion people. And the Chinese government has to consume so many resources just to kind of tamping down simmering discontent. And I think that's really been brought to light in the last couple of years, the preoccupation with that. And it's, things kind of are a zero-sum game. China's not able to kind of devote its time and resources to this tech race. I think there's a lot more fragility in terms of China's ascent, especially in the tech space, than I would have thought a couple of years ago. One last thing on this. I've seen all these different measures that show that China's ahead, but I think a lot of times there are these sort of cherry-picked measures. You could pick 10 other measures and show that the US is way ahead on these. So I'm a little dubious of sort of picking specific measures. And I think that in the aggregate, US private industry and tech is still kind of over the long term, likely to do better than in China.
Mohammed, what's your assessment?
I want to differentiate between what's tactical and what's strategic. China is going through some phases, some problems. COVID, slowdown, growth, I see that. But on the strategic level, we also have to reckon with the fact that the Western/US monopoly over violence, knowledge, and wealth is not there anymore. And that balance of power is moving further east because, again, demographics, geography, in the Indo-Pacific, this is where 2/3 of the global economy is. So on the longer term, even if we have some sort of slowdown on the Chinese edge, I do still believe their overall trend is upward. And that's a fact that I see. I'm a trained engineer. I follow the tech trends from the technological/engineering side. And what you're seeing there is miracles, honestly, in terms of number of engineers per year, the type of projects they're working on, the type of networks, the deployment of these kind of technologies on mass scale. There's no comparison today between America's ability to scale technologies and what China is. China can scale technologies in a massive way in a shorter period of time, in a way we cannot really compete. So my point of view is, yes, we should worry. We also need to reckon with the fact that this is a historical trend, that we shouldn't really see some of these kind of slow down cases in certain aspects of the Chinese economy as this is the longer term, this is the strategic level. On the strategic level, they're growing, they're faster, they're able to scale technologies, they have the manpower that's needed, they develop their own niche in certain technologies that we cannot really compete with them in.
Thank you. That was interesting, and we should circle back to that. Now I'll give Veal a chance to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Sarah and Mohammed, also for the opening remarks. I see that one of the dangers that we face is to always see this from the specter of the Cold War, meaning that we still look at the existing China-US competition from an ideological perspective. You know, even when it comes to our discourse around emerging technologies, we in some way we assume this to be a war between an open innovation paradigm of the United States versus an authoritarian innovation top-down leadership model of China. But if we really look into what's happening within the relationship within China between their own big tech companies, Alibaba, Tencent, and the way the Chinese government is treating them, you know, we can actually question that, if that's the actual case, or maybe there is no war of paradigms here, but we're actually just looking at a very traditional form of competition.
What do you think is traditional about it?
Well, we compete for markets. You know, every living organism wants to grow. Nobody wants to diminish, even though we have a lot of discussion about this degrowth approach, but it's very unnatural. You know, so whenever we build a system, the natural tendency of that system is to grow. So obviously we are faced with limited resources. So now that the Chinese economy and the Chinese influence has gotten so big, obviously it has set itself on a collision course of sort over influence with the West and with America. So I think this is just our very classic paradigm of two powers competing for basically the same space.
Mohammed, can I circle back? Well, I can get your take on that. And also you were talking about the ability of China to scale up and that this dwarfs anything the United States can match. But we have also absorbed a number of foreign engineers into the United States. You're saying it's not enough, that China is in fact a boulder rolling down a hill gathering steam?
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, it's a factor of demographics, and this is a very basic fact. In the United States, you have a gap of around 500,000 tech jobs to fill existing positions that we need in the economy, from cybersecurity to quantum computing to basic coders. We are lagging behind in terms of manpower. I'm trying to look for a gender-neutral term to use instead of manpower. But we have a gap here that's clear in terms of numbers, that's clear in terms of the kind of jobs that we are not really able to fill. And even with us absorbing many immigrants like myself, that's not really enough. I mean, there is a reason why companies in Silicon Valley keep screaming every year about H-1Bs, about the visa applications, about the immigration system, because we need to absorb more and the economy needs more. So I hope we can discuss this further in terms of what are the venues that we need to use to basically able to fill that kind of gap, a human resource gap in the tech space, either opening immigration more to people with high skills. Maybe we need to introduce coding curriculums to K-12 school curriculum, maybe, but we need to discuss that. For China, that's a different game. We're speaking about a country that for the last 45 years, 50 years have been investing heavily in STEM classes and STEM colleges, have universities that's entirely focused on R&D, and these schools are are affiliated with tech Chinese companies. These companies are sponsoring specific schools with a specific focus areas. So you speak about an entire ecosystem that's based. You are thinking about multiple hundreds of Silicon Valleys that exist in China, and you're competing with that. And they're all competing with each other. So they have their own internal market, and you're not really in bar with that. So that's on in terms of number, this in terms of human resource. And then the deployment part. Yes, we have a robust legal system in the United States. Yes, we do have a robust, supposedly, regulations in the country, but we started also to slow down innovation from that standpoint. We're not really helping companies at this point. We just, our own instinct at this point is cracking down on tech companies. We are living through a tech clash that started in 2016 that never ended. We're looking to US companies as enemies rather than partners. That's not really the case in China, even though I do recognize that there are some companies that have been through a hard time in their own relationship with Beijing, Didi, and of course, you name it. But on the fundamental the bulk of Chinese companies are working hand in hand with Chinese government. And that's creating a fusion, an economic fusion. I'm not gonna use the military civil fusion perspective, but in terms of the commercial deployment of technology on the national level, it's unprecedented. And we see that kind of success in terms railway, 5G. I mean, the 5G example is perfect. We're speaking about what? We're speaking about more, I don't have the statistics in my mind, but almost 40% of Chinese cities. That's massive. We're speaking about 40% of what? 1.4, 1.35 billion people. That's massive. It tells you everything you need to know about that level of deployment and scalability in the Chinese economy.
We'll get to the issue of the backlash against the tech companies, but I'd just like to follow up briefly with you on the issue of STEM. There's a lot of talk, there's been a lot of focus on it in the United States. Are you saying that the US educational system simply doesn't cut the mustard?
Yeah, I do. I do believe that. I'm not an education expert. I don't, but I'm a trained engineer. My undergrad degree is a School of Engineering. I did a bachelor degree in critical infrastructure. And I think one of the, as an immigrant to the United States, one of the things that were eye-opening for me is the country's lagging behind in terms of physics and math and calculus and very basic fundamental sciences pre-college. I had friends with me doing a master's in Georgetown who was the first time for them to actually study calculus or code or take advanced statistics in their life. And we're speaking about elite American citizens who had the luxury of having international experience and they graduated from top schools in undergrad. That's not really a good sign. If right now we have a problem integrating STEM in our own pre-college education, you are losing the future. And no matter we are trying to open the door for more immigrants, you're always going to lag behind. Because again, think about India, think about Egypt, think about Nigeria. In terms of STEM graduates, their numbers per year, they're massive. But why they're massive? Because the economy needs that. You need coders. You need people who understand basic tech/cyber skills. And we're not, right now, we're not only speaking about coding, we're speaking about crypto, and Sarah can speak more about that. Crypto, blockchain, do we have the enough human resource to actually understand the Web3 development? We're still even stuck in Web2. We're still stuck in the very basic tech spaces. So that's my view. We're lagging. We need a real review of our own educational system. And it's actually serious. I would say it's almost I want to use exaggerating terms and call it a national security threat, but it's a threat to the future. It's a threat to our own safety and security as a global power that has economic standing.
Sarah?
Thanks, Jacob. I was trying to not jump in. I agree with some of that, and I vehemently disagree with other parts of it. To me, it's hard to argue against the fact that more STEM is always better in schools. I mean, we should do more STEM in schools. I also have written about how we need more H-1B visas if we're going to be producing and building semiconductor manufacturing facilities on our soil. Who do we think who's going to do those jobs? We have a labor shortage. So these things go together, and I completely agree. But I think we don't want to conflate kind of money spent with and on the R&D side with effective output. And that's where I think we have a very different system, the US and China, which is their system, I think, rewards conformity and hard work. Our system, I think, rewards creativity and novelty. And I think, again, I think there was a sense that if we just kind of scale up, that's going to get across the finish line better. But I think what we see is that conformity leads to kind of a lot of derivative output, nothing that's truly groundbreaking and path-breaking. And I think that's where a system that allows companies to innovate and take chances will outpace over the long run, one where the rules are very prescriptive. And I think that we can see with, Jack Ma and Alibaba, the sense of like what happened to Jack Ma. And I think that these kinds of circumstances are very sort of illustrative to innovators in China, which is that, it's the implicit and explicit signals that are given about towing the line all the time. And I think that some of that probably leads to this positive scaling that Mohammed was just talking about. But I think they're also sort of putting innovation straitjackets on what they're actually going to be able to produce. Second, on the demographic factor, I think that their large population is a double-edged sword. 1.3 billion people, that's a lot of people to fill your labor force, but it's also a lot of people to feed. It's a lot of people to prevent getting COVID. I mean, it was pretty shocking to see a city of 25 million people, Shanghai, go into lockdown. So I think that experience, or what we saw, and the difficulty of a Chinese regime to try to kind of keep that population something other than restive, is a real kind of preoccupation of the regime that takes a lot of effort and resources. So I don't think that we can look at demographics as a unmitigated good. Also, that population is going to get old. What then when they leave the labor force? And this sort of one-child policy that they had for a long time means that you're going to have this very top-heavy population that has to be taken care of. So that also is kind of a collision course economically. So I'm not as bullish on this Chinese model. And I think that the US model, which I understand has its vulnerabilities, does, I think, over the long term, will produce dividends. Sorry, one last thing. Yes, I think just in terms of innovation and research centers and this H-1B question that we were just talking about. I mean, I think the ability of the US to attract people, and I say this with leaning into my biases of being in a university, but we attract people from the best scholars and engineers from all over the world. And I don't think there's any accident in that. And I think the more of that we can do, because our system is one in which people want to participate in, I think that also will accelerate the US.
Very interesting. I think we should let Veal respond first, since he's been lurking on the margins of this discussion. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I happen to disagree with the need for more STEM positions, because what I see, I come from a country, from Finland, where I guess we have, without having the statistics on hand to prove my point, we probably have one of the highest STEM graduates per capita in the world. So we are known to be a nation of engineers in Finland. However, if I look into the history of innovation, we can see that the Americans have been leading with invention, and the Chinese model. And some people like Kai-Fu Lee, the former CEO of Google in China, has said that perhaps the age of invention is over, and we are entering a new age where the Chinese are doing much better, which is to connect dots, is basically to take the existing platforms and making them interoperable. And I think, that's something that the Chinese are brilliant. And I think, what we need in the United States is more understanding of how interoperability works, especially now that we're looking geopolitically at this decoupling between the US and China. So China is developing their own architectures and platforms, and so is the United States. But the companies who are in the middle, who need to stay competitive in a global marketplace, they need to be able to speak both languages, of both types of platforms. So I think that's something that we're really missing in the conversation at the moment.
I feel like I should give Mohammed a chance to respond to both of you, since you've taken issue, which is good. I said at the beginning of this that contention is good for these panels, and everyone looked a little dubious, but now it has indeed emerged.
I'm gonna build on what Sarah said. More STEM is always good. And again, I'm approaching this as an engineer, not really as a policy professional. Why I'm saying that? Because the geopolitical map is not really being drawn across boundaries and geographies right now. We are fighting over the information infrastructure. So yes, troops on the ground is important, but the infrastructure of information is very fundamental to that, right? We have Ukraine, and for us to keep Ukraine online, we had a Starlink literally giving more than 1,000 devices to the Ukrainian military to deploy all over the country to make sure that Ukraine stays online during the Russian offensive operation. So what does it tell us? It tells us that geopolitics is changing because of technology. And that means technology is not only fundamental to economies and social life, but also geopolitics. That per se means that our need for more knowledge and more experience and more members of our own society being very well versed in tech, cyber, and data is a must. And that also means that our own understanding of what's a percentage of our society that should be engineers should change. I don't really per se call for having a number of engineers. I'm saying understanding of tech. And let's talk about foreign policy for itself. When still looking into our own relations as a country with the Gulf, with West Africa, with Eastern Mediterranean countries, we still really perceive it from a regional perspective, right? We're only thinking about it from historical grievances, both Second World War, Gulf War, Iran. We're not really looking to the new ones and how tech has impacted our own relationship. We're not really looking to the new data sovereignty approach that has been predominant, for example, in the Gulf, that many of these countries, many of our own allies and partners right now want to close their data ecosystem. We are not really looking to what the Chinese 5G expansion means for our own personal relationship, for our own strategic relations with many of our own partners, not allies, but partners. What does it mean that right now we have a new co-production / collaboration on the tech level between China and many nations across Africa, emerging markets, Southeast Asia, and the Arabian Gulf. So far, we're still sitting behind. We don't know what's happening. We still think it's all about just oil. It's only about trade. It's only about the very traditional factors that define our own bilateral relations in the last, let's say, 50, 60, 70 years. That's not a new game. And in the piece I wrote for the national interest, I was trying to highlight some of these new ones that we need to have much more innovative understanding. So when I say that we need a diplomat that understands tech, I believe that this is a must at this point. I think if we are deploying diplomats in capitals, they should be able to understand what does it mean that this X country is having a new data law, and this data law saying location data is sensitive data, it cannot be transferred overseas. So what does it mean for Uber, one of our own unicorns right now? What does it mean that countries are trying to have 5G networks that are built by ZTE or Huawei? What does it mean for our own intelligence sharing agreements or understanding with X country? What does it? So you need diplomats who understand that, and they cannot really understand that if they don't have some sort of a training that makes them much more equipped to grasp with these kind of developments. I know it's a long story to make my argument, but that's basically my argument. The future, and we are right now living in the future, we need to expand our own knowledge of tech. It's very fundamental. It's not really a luxury. And tech stuff are not only confined to Silicon Valley, Facebook and Meta, it's actually, it's cornerstone to our own foreign policy and standing globally.
Wow, I didn't expect that Chaz Freeman's question would incite such a prolonged dialogue, but it actually found it quite interesting. And there's a question that I'd like to follow up with that segues nicely from Paul Hare, who is a fellow at the Center for the National Interest and himself an expert on the region. And he asks, and I'm going to collapse his two questions into one, because I think they mate nicely. He asks, is this necessarily a winner-take-all game in which one side must emerge as the dominant power? Are we assuming that the Chinese have this goal, or does China want to be not the leader? Is a shared collaboration possible between Beijing and Washington? Then he even goes on to ask, does the political will currently exist in the United States to allow US-China technological collaboration in the academic realm and beyond? Why don't we start with Sarah?
Yeah, that's a great provocation. I'll try to disentangle a couple of those, but I'm sort of most struck by the last part about political will, because I think that really is kind of the linchpin to all of this. I mean, we can talk about strategy and economics, but at the end of the day, I mean, I think these are fundamentally political questions. And so, and maybe I'll just illustrate with an example that I think speaks to this, which is the US legislation to reshore the semiconductor manufacturing. And so what we've done in the last few years is kind of recognize, US politically has coalesced in ways that are just unheard of in this polarized climate, that both sides of the aisle think that China's a threat to our semiconductor supply chain resilience. And so there have been a series of legislative initiatives that are coming around to providing billions of dollars to reshore US manufacturing of semiconductors. And what's interesting about that, as I've written about elsewhere, is that these are effects that are going to take place over 5 or 10 years. And it's not clear to me that this is anything other than self-defeating economically, because we have, centuries, literally almost centuries of kind of neoliberal ideas where globalization and comparative advantage, kind of the rising tide of comparative advantage will lift all boats. And we're going backwards on that. And I think the reason we're going backwards on that is fundamentally political, which is kind of the China threat. And if they're gaining, it must mean that we're losing. And so, the number that always gets cited is that 3 decades ago, the US accounted for something like 40% of the global share of manufacturing of semiconductor chips, and now it's 10%. And much of that has been taken over by China. But I think that whole rhetoric then it sort of becomes this overarching kind of umbrella under which all of these other changes take place. And so I think that's right, that this political question is so fundamental, but I do worry, frankly, that it is losing sight of really kind of core economic ideas of comparative advantage. I don't think the US, I think we saw this in Latin America, of import substitution. They try to do everything on their own shores. It's not efficient to do that. And I think this is something that we need to really especially be attentive to in this era of inflation, which is if I tried to make my breakfast in my garden every day, it would be really time consuming and expensive. There's a reason we outsource things. And I think that is now kind of being called into question, but I think for nothing other than political reasons. I will just caveat what I said and say that I don't think everything should be globally integrated. I think there are questions where national security issues are salient. We don't need to get into an intense, intelligence sharing agreement with China because we know that's sensitive. But what I worry about is this like national security label gets slapped onto everything, and then we don't even ask the questions of whether economically it makes sense anymore.
Veal, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I see that the real danger is really seeing this as a zero-sum game, because it's not. Like Mohammed was saying in his share, was that we have US allies who are adopting and have adopted certain critical infrastructures from China, and they are still US allies. So we need to find a way how to cope with this reality in such a way that it's still in alignment with US strategic objectives in this world. And the second question that kind of comes to me from this discussion is that who is the winner? If the main actors within this technological competition are corporations and other non-state actors, how could we say that the winner, if there is a winner that would emerge from this competition, would be either US or China? Maybe it's a company. And then the question to be asked is, well, what are the objectives of that company if the winner is a non-state actor? And what is the meaning of that winning to US foreign policy? And I think, that's something that we need a lot more discussion about. I fully agree also with Mohammed, that every nation should also have a diplomatic outpost in the Silicon Valley, as well as in Shanghai or somewhere where China is developing theirs. I think this is absolutely imperative that we have this kind of on the diplomatic level, on the foreign policy level, that we have an understanding of where technology is emerging. So I think just very often the challenge that we have as observers of geopolitics is that we assume that all the non-state actors are simply proxies of state actors. And even if we look at currently at what's taking place in Ukraine, we can really, we used to think that, everything that happens globally, what the Wagner Group is doing with the paramilitary troops, this is all, in alignment with what the Kremlin is doing. However, it seems less and less likely as we go along. And it really seems that a lot of these proxy actors, corporations, they have, in a way, a mind of their own. And I think, this is something that we as geopolitical analysts are still having a hard time in dealing with.
Well, Mohammed, your name was invoked several times. Do you want to comment?
I think we're in line here. I agree with Sarah in a rare bipartisan fashion. There is a rare consensus in DC regarding China and how China is being perceived. And we shouldn't look further than the guiding strategic principles that the Biden administration released and how they are somehow aligned with what the previous administration has been saying and writing, specifically in the National Defense Strategy. So there is what the Biden administration is doing is they are building on some of Trump's policies regarding Taiwan, China, Great Power competition. So it also gives you an idea about how China itself became almost a unifier in the foreign policy space here in DC. That will make the whole idea of collaborating where we can and compete where we should hard. It's a hard balance. I don't think we are going to maintain that. I think we're already, Ukraine war is also complicating that. My point is, it's very hard to see us collaborating with the Chinese. Is going to be much more toxic, much more politically sensitive. Is going to have some consequences in the election cycles. Very hard for me to see a US elected official / president basically able to keep a promise of collaborating with the Chinese on some of the good files like climate change and others. So it's very difficult to see that. But what does it mean on tech? It means that it's going to be zero-sum game. It's going to be a game of who is able to maintain superiority in certain tech. The Trump administration sanctions against Huawei is a clear example of what how far Washington is willing to go in limiting Chinese tech and the penetration of Chinese tech. That's something that we have to keep in mind. And even right now, when the Biden administration went further by trying to limit the Chinese access to SML, a very fundamental component of the semiconductor ecosystem. So again, it tells you, even though it's a much more disciplined administration in terms of talking points, much more willing to talk with the Chinese directly, there is limited space to collaborate with the Chinese. We are much more on an escalation cycle, and this is what's going to define the relationship for the next 10 to 15 years.
I was going to say, we have a comment from Robert Hormats, who I think most of you will agree with, but if you don't, you can jump in here. He says, can you really overcome the trust factor about technological superiority, since it is central for military superiority, which would probably make technological collaboration almost impossible? Does anyone want to jump in on that? Veal, you look like you have something to say.
Well, I mean, I agree with what Bob is asking. You know, I think it's a major issue. You know, how do we actually build the mindset in order to have space for collaboration? You know, because we all want to win, and you know, I think, you know, especially in America, you know, we come from a culture where winning is important. But if we take that attitude and try to work with the Chinese, you know, they have, like, you know, like has been said by the other panelists several times, you know, they have their own culture. So they don't look at things from a tactical, how do we win this game or this battle, because they want to win the war. And, you know, their perspective and the time horizon is significantly longer than that of the, let's say, the average US policymaker. And I think, you know, that is definitely something that we have to kind of learn to deal with. So I think the beginning is really to both know who we are, but also understand who are the other guys. And I think we're really missing out on this point, especially I see that now with regards to Russia. So I see all of the research centers that have been focused on researching Russia, they are stopping their operations, as if somehow not understanding what Russia wants to do, and basically turning a blind eye to what they are saying would somehow solve the current crisis. And I don't know how that's possible. I mean, I was just reading the book by Kissinger on his White House years. And I mean, he was making such a brilliant case in that book that, you know, if we don't know what the Chinese are about, you know, if we don't know them as human beings, how can we build coherent US foreign policy with regards to these people? And I think the same thing applies at this moment, you know, with our whole conversation, both with China as well as with Russia. Jacob, you are muted.
I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit, still inflected by what we've been talking about. Since I am in Washington, or a couple of us are, I'm going to ask you a policy question. President Biden is traveling to the Asia Pacific next week. There is a bunch of proposed legislation in Congress on these cyber issues. Michael Bennet, Senator from Colorado, is proposing a Digital Platform Act. There's also a Digital Privacy Act. And then Amy Klobuchar is the American Innovation and Choice Online Act. The response from the tech companies and some advocates of big tech is that this proposed legislative acts would be inimical to promoting American national security, that they would in fact weaken us in the very area that we need to be focusing on. So I'll start with Mohammed, Sarah, and then Veal. What is your take on, I realize I lumped together several pieces of legislation, but what is your take on this argument?
I mean, it's a very tough question. I mean, they are American companies by the end of the day. They are US companies, and they are perceived as American companies by EU, China, Russia, and the rest of the world. So we cannot really say they are not. They are. And again, it's a reflection of the tensions that exist between the Valley and DC that started, I would say, in 2016 onward. And we are still see our tech companies as enemies that we need to contain and whip, and making sure they are staying down. The problem is on the strategic level, that's our own demise. We cannot afford to make our own tech companies less competitive overseas. We cannot afford that our tech companies are not able to hold the line on the tech space. Eventually, we know that we have many countries that do not really have a strategic interest in having free and open internet and transfer of data. That's a fight. That's a big fight. And that's also integral to our own values as a democratic nation. That's basically what we care about. This is basically our own fundamental belief. And my standpoint here is, I do understand there's a need for regulations. This is the whole role of Congress. This is the role of legislators. But there is, in my opinion, there is overreach in terms of how far some of these regulations are proposing in terms of the limits they want to put on US companies. I don't believe it's strategic. I don't believe it's long-term. I don't believe that this will benefit us in great part competition. If right now we understand and recognize that other nations are investing heavily in their own national champions, this is not the moment for us to basically say, we don't really see you as American anymore, and it's time for us to basically punish you because of some of these kind of political internal dynamics that we have in the United States. So that's my my response in an abstract way.
Sarah, do you agree?
100%. I just to fact check myself, I looked up the largest companies in the United States by market share, and I just want to cite that: Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Tesla, top 5. So we are in a world in which big tech is at the center of our national economy, and the national economy is at the center of our national defense. And so any measures that, as Mohammed said, would make that industry less competitive, which all of this legislation would have the downstream effect of doing, is really problematic for us economically, and therefore from a perspective of competitiveness and national security. I would submit that these are just pure political plays on the part of legislators. They know that this plays well with a domestic audience. They also know these measures are probably not going to get passed. A couple months ago, Cory Booker had, with 2 other senators, advanced legislation called the Ban Surveillance Advertising Act. And you kind of dig a little bit, and it's completely clear that they don't understand the business model of how these companies work. And I've seen that every time that these CEOs from these tech firms come to Capitol Hill, and the questions that are asked show how little these members of Congress understand, how little they know about these tech firms. And so just as a sort of second point or third point, I'm very wary of trying to legislate by individuals on Capitol Hill who don't seem to understand what this technology is about.
Are you saying they've aged out?
I mean, the average age of a US senator is not young. I just think, you know, and I think the problem is that that's not their comparative advantage. I mean, and this is why I think there needs to be that dialogue between the public space and the private space, but I don't think that it's I don't think it's the sort of jurisdiction of these publicly elected officials to try. I don't think it's possible even to understand the technology well enough to really make sense of it in a way that can meaningfully address the concerns that we might all agree are problems without kneecapping these industries.
Veal, I wonder what you think, just to sharpen it a little bit. Bennett's proposal even calls for a 5-person commission that could be based, I think, in the FTC to monitor content, algorithms. Do you think this is a fool's errand, or is it a logical step in response to concerns on both the right and the left?
Well, I think the first point really to understand is that, it totally makes sense what Mohammed and Sarah have been saying from a foreign policy and strategic goals of the United States. However, if we look at how political discussion, it really revolves around domestic situation and, economics within the United States. So I can see that somehow the foreign policy implications of certain legislative drafts and acts, they somehow get lost in that discussion, because everybody is still deep down looking inside of what's best for the American economy. But I do agree with you, Jacob, that perhaps what we have is this disparity, that we have extremely young entrepreneurs, we have, I don't know what but I guess, also what we saw is that the average age to become a Fortune 500 company, is getting smaller and smaller each year. So I think now at this moment, I think the latest study was from 2018, and I think we're now less than 20 years. So it takes less than 20 years to become a Fortune 500 company, whereas, even just a decade ago, we were looking at 50 to 60 years. And, 20 years ago, we were looking at over 100 years. So basically the generational wealth, how that is being formed today in the United States and in the world, it's become a very young act. And obviously, perhaps, the way legislation works hasn't evolved as radically in the last 20 years, as our wealth generation has. So I think there is a challenge on how to cope with that. However, I agree with the initial comments by Mohammed that, since all of these foreign competitors to American companies are being heavily supported and in many extents also subsidized by their respective governments, it would definitely not be helpful for the United States to hinder the development of these companies if strategic geopolitical technological competition on a global scale is of importance to the United States.
Well, it obviously is. We have yet another question from Paul Hare, who's doing stalwart duty here, but I'm very intrigued by his question because it's the same one that I had going into this session. And it is about the other great power, or former great power, Russia, which has now stumbled or lurched into what appears to be a morass in Ukraine. And Paul asks, where did Russia fit into this tech competition before Ukraine? And how will the war affect its global competitiveness in the future? Why don't we start with Veal, and then we'll go back to Sarah and then Mohammed.
Oh, I think a great example of that is that if we just look at, certain data sets, we might miss the big picture. So if we look, for example, at the strength of the ruble, we might see that the ruble is one of the best performing currencies in the world this year. And obviously that would give a very false picture about the actual strength of the Russian economy. I think Russia is still, the innovation system has been heavily dependent on its Soviet legacy. And I think they have been struggling a lot. So my own country, Finland, has been heavily integrated in trying to develop the Russian innovation ecosystem. And that kind of was going rather well, let's say, during the presidency of Medvedev from 2008 to 2012. During those 4 years. However, all of the major innovation initiatives in Russia have stalled. The Skolkovo Business School, which was supposed to become the Russian equivalent of Harvard Business School, has largely stalled. And I think the challenge there is that they don't seem to have a model. They don't seem to have an innovation paradigm to offer to the world. And in terms of the global competitiveness, I mean, if we look at the largest Russian companies, these have been heavily carbon fuel based energy conglomerates, who are massively integrated to the world economy. However, what we have seen is that it seems to be that it's been relatively easy to cut Russia out of the global economy. So I thought that it would have been much more difficult than it actually seems that it. So I think the level of integration of Russia into the global economy has been a myth, which I think this crisis is also showing us. Because domestically, if we look at the domestic indicators of the Russian economy, everything actually seems to be going quite well. And the reason for that is that Russia actually hasn't been as integrated with the global economies as we have previously thought. So I think definitely it's not a major competitor in these emerging tech fields to United States and China. However, I do feel that one thing that we should be mindful of as the United States, as we go along with more and more financial and economic sanctions, is Russia does have an enormous pool of high-level scientists in the mathematics and physics fields. So are we actually pushing them to now integrate themselves with China? And if they do get integrated on a strategic level with China over the long term, what will be the strategic implications of that to United States? And I think that was something that Henry Kissinger was asking last weekend when he spoke at the Financial Times Weekend Forum, where he was saying that it didn't make sense during the Nixon administration to basically assume that even though it might look that Russia or then Soviet Union and China's positions on global issues might be aligned, they never align on every single field. So it would be a mistake for US policymakers to assume that they would always converge. So we should still have our own relationship with both of them.
Very good point. Sarah, do you have a comment?
No, these are great insights, which I really appreciate. I mean, I think that the sort of for decades, there's been a tendency to conflate Russia and China, and I'm not suggesting that you were doing that, Jacob, but it can be really easy to do. It's like, well, we put our foes all in one bucket, and realism would tell us that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But in that case, so they align because they have this sort of antipathy toward the U.S. But I think in Russia's case, its strength sort of stems from a much sort of narrower base. They have commodities and they have nuclear weapons, and they have like a rogue sort of cyber unit. And these things together are not nothing. They're not trivial, but I think they're on a much less scale than sort of the China, which is a much more multi-dimensional collaborator, competitor, whatever we want to call it. In terms though, and I agree with Veal that the degree to which they were integrated before the war is not to the extent, I think we're seeing that it was not to the extent that may have been misperceived. But I think that they, even having said that, they certainly have crossed the Rubicon. I mean, this is very like punditocracy comment here, but McDonald's, which is now withdrawing from Russia, and we had like the Tom Friedman like McDonald's index. And it just very, like, if you grew up in this era of like the Cold War, which I did, and, you know, McDonald's then established a perch in Russia after all these years, and we're gonna have peace, you know, and now they're withdrawing. It does feel in this kind of symbolic way that that's a real kind of indicator. And I don't see that going back. I mean, this sort of speaks to one of the comments in Bob's comment about trust. I think now that Russia will be this global pariah that very few other countries will trust. And I think China will say that they will be by Russia's side at all costs. But I'm not really sure, because there is a sort of, again, this rogue pariah element to Russia that I think will be difficult to trust. I do wonder too, which direction, you know, the brain drain, if there's brain drain from Russia, which way that will go. I know, again, here in higher education, we have Russian computer scientists that now can't go home. They also don't have a lot of resources because their family's assets have been frozen. So they will just stay here at Cornell and work with us and kind of, you know, enrich our university environment. And so I think just overall, in the aggregate, this is a real net negative for Russia. And I just think it will be hard, to the limited extent that it was integrated before. I think that will be all the more difficult now.
Well, Mohammed, I guess the final word goes to you.
It's very unfair, Jacob. I think it's very hard for me to outsmart the points that Sarah and Will just raised. So I don't want to rehash. I absolutely agree with both of them regarding what they said. Maybe I'll add a little bit, saying we might see a silicon curtain emerging. I know it's a new term, but we might find that, because what we understand for now, that because of the Western sanctions and how robust the sanction regime is, there are some problems in terms of the Russian hardware ecosystem. Semiconductors is core to that part. And we have to think about what's the strategic consequences, because right now Russia is almost cut from the semiconductor supply line, that what's needed for emerging tech in China, in Russia. That means they need to fill that gap. And if they need to fill that gap, they need to look for a partner that has capabilities that are similar to the capabilities that they used to have before the war in Ukraine. That partner is China. So in terms of filling that tech gap, you're going to have Beijing is stepping up in that kind of side. And the indications that we got from Beijing is they're not really slowing down on some of these aspects of collaboration with Moscow. That, in my opinion, given what Sarah said about the brain drain, that's going to be unprecedented. And you can see that in the intellectual side, on the STEM side, there are a lot of Russian exilees at this point. Cooperation with China in tech, that will reconfigure, in my opinion, the entire tech landscape of Russia on the medium to long term. And I don't know what does it mean on the strategic level yet, because we didn't really see it. We understand it's going to happen, but what are the consequences? I don't know. I think it's very hard to foresee that. But we can agree on that you're going to have some sort of tech sphere that exists and includes Moscow and Beijing in the same space.
Well, we are ending right on the dot, as I promised our panelists, all three of whom regularly write for the National Interest website. I urge you to read what they write, and I implore our panelists to continue writing for us. Based on today's session, I found it extremely illuminating. I'd like to thank all three of you for participating, and we will be posting it on the website as well if you're interested in looking back at what we've discussed today. Thank you, and that concludes our session today.
Thank you.